to Disability News and Views, a production of the City of Boston's Disabilities Commission. It's April, and that means it's National Fair Housing Month. We recognize Fair Housing Month alongside communities, fair housing advocates, and others, because it's an important act that raises awareness of fair housing rights. The Fair Housing Act of 1968 prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, national orientation, religion, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, disability, and familial status. Today's episode of Disability News and Views, we will explore how this important topic impacts people with disabilities. In our community conversation segment, you will hear from Felix Jordan, a local housing advocate, and later in the show, you will hear Disability Commissioner and ADA Title II Coordinator Kristen McCosh interview Alexis Buckley from the Mayor's Office of Housing. We have an exciting show for you today, and we think you're going to find this very informative. So without further ado, I want to kick it over to our co-host, Ken Meyer, for a community conversation with housing advocate Felix Jordan.
Thank you, Colleen. And Felix, it's nice to talk to you. Start by, if you would, giving us a little bit of your background and how you got involved with housing and BCIL.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. I got involved with BCIL when I was sort of looking for a postgraduate job. And I saw that BCIL was looking for a community organizer. Something that really attracted me to the role is that it mentioned working on housing, and that through the Alternative Housing Voucher Program, there was a skilled nursing transition program that was certain vouchers, a certain number of vouchers were set aside for folks who were trying to get out of nursing homes. I had a family member who had a really negative experience with a nursing home, and so I was feeling like this would be a great way for me to do something productive with the anger and frustration I was feeling. And I got the job, and I was really fortunate. So that's how I got here.
Okay. Talk about the disability rights movement, if you would.
Absolutely. So I think there's a lot to talk about when it comes to the disability rights movement. Obviously, we have like the development of the independent living centers as a really big sort of outcome of the disability movement. I think a lot, especially with the ongoing and proposed PCA program cuts, that there really is a big place for it. Also BCIL is the Boston Center of Independent Living. I should have said that earlier. But I think a lot about how a lot of people don't fully know the history of the disability rights movement. I feel like I didn't learn a lot about the disability rights movement until I got to college through elective courses, and sort of learning about things about how like parks were inaccessible and different like spaces that were supposed to be really public access. Yeah.
Okay. How long have you been at BCIL? And has it been a struggle to get things better?
I think there's always a little bit of struggle. I guess it's been 2 whole years now that I've been at the Boston Center for Independent Living. I think that there have been a lot of things that have felt very long, but ultimately very good. Increasing funding for the Alternative Housing Voucher Program is something that felt easier than I thought it would be, but still very difficult. I think just seeing still, with all the progress, seeing how much there is to go, seeing how much legislators don't necessarily know, not because they don't care, but just because people with disabilities are not included. I think that part can sort of be a struggle sometimes, seeing how much we don't know, but I think it's also been kind of exciting seeing how much people are willing to learn and listen to folks in the disability community. I think that's super important, and I think that's good to see, but I definitely think there's a long way to go. And seeing the history of the disability rights movement and knowing how much more there is to go can sort of be hard, but it's exciting because, you know, there's a lot of work to do, and it's exciting to be a part of that work.
Talk, if you would, about housing and housing discrimination.
Absolutely. So housing is extremely, extremely hard to find for folks in Massachusetts, especially all across the country, but with the greater Boston area having such expensive housing and a lot of hoops to get through housing, I remember reading something that said, I think Metro Boston has a really, really tight vacancy rate. There's just like not a lot of apartments to go around. That gets so much harder when you are on a fixed income, when you are maybe working less hours because of your disability. There's also the fact that like a lot of folks, not in Massachusetts, but a lot of folks across the country with disabilities are working for sub-minimum wage. So housing is just even harder to find and afford, which means that a lot of people can't live independently even if they want to. But I think one thing that also sort of exists, especially in Massachusetts, is the old housing stock. A lot of Massachusetts housing stock was built before the ADA, and so as such kind of got grandfathered in. It didn't have to be made accessible. So there's really, really a shortage of accessible housing. I think there's a requirement of 5 to 10% statewide. Obviously, we've got a long way to go. It's estimated that 1 in 4 Americans has a disability. Even if that's not a physical one, we need to get our numbers of accessible housing to sort of match the ways, like the population. We want to make sure that our housing reflects the needs, wants, comfort, and safety of the population that it's attempting to serve. And it's really clear that it doesn't do that yet. I would say there's also something really, really unfortunate to be said about the ways in which folks are able to discriminate for folks who are most marginalized and need housing. In the state of Massachusetts, housing discrimination is illegal, which is really good. Discriminating against folks for having a voucher, for having a disability, that's all illegal. It can be reported to the Mass Office Against Discrimination. That's really, really exciting. What kind of hurts though is that there isn't a lot of teeth. So people can report landlords and housing providers, but it doesn't necessarily get to the root of the issue. And one of the things I first did when I came to BCIL that I really, really liked was working with the Suffolk Law housing discrimination testing program. They do a lot of testing specifically around racial discrimination, voucher holder status, and disability. They also work with folks sometimes who need help because they've been victims of discrimination, unfortunately. I think also letting people know their rights. The amount of people who are told by landlords that they don't take vouchers, that's not legal. And people really don't necessarily know that they have recourse, especially when you're looking for housing. That's not the first thing that comes to mind. So again, a lot of work to be done, and it's a really, really huge issue, but I think there are a lot of ways that we can sort of work to address that problem and continue to do so. So hopefully that the state of Massachusetts housing is better for everyone.
What other challenges are there that disabled people encounter while seeking housing?
So I think cost, finding accessible housing. I also think that a lot of people don't fully know what accessible housing is. And it ends up just being like, well, you can maybe fit a wheelchair in here rather than thinking about how folks can actually be comfortable, how they can navigate the space, access different storage parts and things like that. Making sure that a unit isn't just like you can be in the unit, but that you can be an active part of community in your space is really important. And I think that's something that needs to be improved and hopefully we'll see improved in the near future.
What sources are available for people seeking housing?
Seeking housing, Housing Navigator is a really big one. It's a website where people can use to find affordable and accessible housing in their area. There are listings from across the state, so it's a really great resource. People can get some housing help from their local independent living center as well. If you live in Boston, the Boston Center for Independent Living is your local ILC. You can have someone who won't do the housing search for you, but can definitely help get you to the right place and find resources, as well as your local housing authority.
Okay. And how can viewers contact BCIL and other places for accessible housing?
Absolutely. So you can look up your local housing authority, give them a call. Sometimes they don't respond. Hopefully they will. You can contact Boston Center for Independent Living by calling 617-338-6900. 6665. And we also have a website as well, which is bostoncil.org for more information, as well as getting in contact with folks.
Okay, I hope that you are successful in your endeavor. Housing seems to be a big problem, and I'm sure you're going to help rectify it. And I wish you all the luck in the world in doing it.
Thank you. I really hope I can.
Oh, I think so. And now we'll turn things over to Commissioner Kristen McCosh, who has another exciting special guest.
Thank you, Ken. I'm glad to be here today to welcome my guest, Alexis Buckley, from the Mayor's Office of Housing. Welcome, Alexis.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Great to see you today. I'd like to start by having you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do at MOH.
Sure. Thanks again. I'm with the Mayor's Office of Housing, but I've been with something called the Affirmative Fair Housing Marketing Program that's part of the Boston Fair Housing Commission and was previously housed at the Office of Fair Housing and Equity. I've been with them since late 2014, coming up on 10 years. I work with developers, property managers, and sometimes realtors or something called a housing lottery agent to draft contracts for income restricted units, often referred to as affordable housing units with the city. These can be projects or units funded through the city of Boston, through the Mayor's Office of Housing. They can also be units that are part of the public housing units through the Boston Housing Authority, and they can be part of the inclusionary zoning program, also known as the Inclusionary Development Policy Program.
Great. So we'll dive into details about each of those in a few minutes, but you mentioned housing, and I'm sure everybody knows that housing is probably Boston's biggest challenge, and even more so for people with disabilities. April is recognized as Fair Housing Month, so we really want to talk about these issues and try to get our viewers all the information they can if they're experiencing challenges with housing. So I'm so glad Alexis is here to dig into these things. So we know that the city does a lot of work to increase the availability of accessible units. Could you talk a little bit about the different types of housing that the city has? You mentioned BHA, Boston Housing Authority. You mentioned private developments. Just give an overview of the type of housing that's available in the city.
Sure. There's market rate housing that's built out for people with disabilities, but for our shop, we're working with developers who, for city funded projects or projects that get money through the Mayor's Office of Housing, there's a requirement for 10% of those units to be built out for people with disabilities. And for this specifically, it's people with mobility impairments or people who are deaf, hard of hearing. For inclusionary development, they have to follow the Mass Architectural Access Board requirements. 5% have to be mobility, built out for people with mobility impairments, 2% built out for people who are deaf, hard of hearing. And we do try to push folks to build out more with varying degrees of success.
That's great. So I know you and I had worked together a few years ago on a disability housing task force, along with people from the Boston Center for Independent Living, like Felix, our earlier guest. And we did a lot of great work. And one of the things that came out of that was the city's requirement for 10% of their housing units to be accessible if they're using city-funded money. Do you have any examples of buildings that may have gone above and beyond and done a lot for accessible or affordable housing?
Sure. The examples that come to mind are actually some home ownership opportunities where it's not actually a requirement, but the city does encourage. And Olmsted Green is a project that's up and running now, and it's home ownership, and all of the units are adaptable, and that's the requirement. But they've actually made some build outs, and they're prioritizing households with disabilities for all of these units, and that's a huge win. That's a big win.
Yeah, home ownership is something that we don't always talk about, but it is important. And one thing that kind of plays into that is housing vouchers for people who have housing vouchers and are residents of a BHA property. They can use their vouchers if they have a disability. They can use those vouchers towards a mortgage. Do you know much about that program?
I know that it's right now, BHA, the Boston Housing Authority, is far ahead of others in this field, but it's not exclusively limited to households and public housing in Boston, right? Cambridge is coming up with their own program. So you'll see more and more of these opportunities to take, if you live in public housing, you can get, you can basically use a voucher to pay your mortgage. You have to, you have to demonstrate some financial success in that, like, you have you've saved money, right? You have to be able to get a mortgage, and you have to demonstrate that to the bank that you have consistent, you make consistent payments.
But the thing that's so promising is that the city's created a pathway for home ownership for people who are traditionally marginalized, like people with disabilities and people of lower economic status. So we're really excited about that.
Yeah, it's so exciting. And it's relatively new. Different versions of this have been explored in the past. It's relatively new, but it's getting great traction, more so than it ever has in the past. And we have, whenever there are informational sessions, or we'll post it on Metro List, which we'll talk about more later.
Great. So can you just explain a little bit about the voucher system, how that works?
Sure. So, I mean, it's that phase was that it's really complicated. There are multiple types of vouchers, and Felix had mentioned, there's I believe you mentioned, I believe she mentioned the alternative housing voucher program for people with disabilities, right?
Yep.
Anybody who doesn't have a voucher but has a disability, and this is not just limited to people with mobility impairment or people who are deaf, hard of hearing. This is any type of disability. They can apply through something called CHAMP. It's the public housing portal. Fill out an application and you can apply for one of these vouchers, and use it anywhere. As Felix had also mentioned, it's one of the highest forms of discrimination. Like, having a voucher is one of the highest forms of discrimination. In Massachusetts, it's protected. It's called a source of income protection. And what it means, particularly for city-funded projects or inclusionary projects for the city, is that you can't be screened for credit. The voucher is, I'm veering into rental. Just to be clear, I know we were just talking about home ownership, but for rental, if you have a voucher, income minimums don't apply to you because you'd have the voucher. And you can use them, really, you can use them anywhere that will cover the rent, right? A lot of folks will think that they can't use vouchers for units that are advertised through lotteries. It's not true.
Wow, that's interesting. I don't even know if I made that distinction.
Yeah, a lot of those inclusionary units where they're more expensive, right? They have higher, what they call area median income. If your voucher will cover that, there's City of Boston vouchers, which have a higher pay rate than other vouchers. Those are great. Those are perfect for some of the more expensive units.
Amazing.
Yeah.
So a few of the things, just to summarize, we talked about the Boston Housing Authority, and they have dedicated buildings. I'm sure people are familiar with them, housing developments in the neighborhoods. And they also have certain buildings that are just for elderly or disabled residents. So people with disabilities can get housing there, or in a traditional family development. They're not limited to the elderly disabled buildings. And then we also have private market rate housing and housing that you can rent in the community with a voucher. So these are just some examples of the different pathways that we're trying to create for people to access housing. And then we also mentioned the housing ownership opportunities, which are really exciting.
That's true. One more I want to add quickly is that there are things called project-based vouchers that you'll see advertised on Housing Navigator and Metro List, wherever you see like 0 for the rent or 30% of household income where the rent would be listed, that means that there's a voucher attached to that unit. If you moved out, you couldn't take it with you, but you'd only be paying a percentage of your household income. And those are really great opportunities as well.
And project-based, so that means you move into one of the BHA developments and the voucher stays there.
It's not necessary. It doesn't even have to be BHA. There are other city funded projects that have vouchers through Metro Housing, like they're from the state, but Metro Housing would be the issuing agency, and they're attached to the project.
Okay, that's great.
Fantastic. Yeah, so it's not public housing, it's mixed income housing.
Oh, okay. And yep, that makes sense. So now can you talk a little bit about the lottery process? I know that you're involved with that, and how that works and how people can, get involved.
Sure. So I keep mentioning MetroList. It's a clearinghouse of income restricted or affordable housing opportunities throughout Greater Boston. All the City of Boston sponsored lotteries will be advertised there first. If they have units built out for people with disabilities, they're also going to be advertised on Housing Navigator. That's a requirement. That's where statewide, I think Felix, you mentioned this as well, units built out for people with disabilities are advertised.
Can I ask,
Sure.
Navigator, is that the old Mass Access?
It took over for Mass Access, yes.
So some people watching may be familiar with Mass Access. Just so you know, that didn't go away, but it's kind of morphed into this new website called Housing Navigator. Is that right?
That's exactly right.
Okay, great. And then I would highly recommend signing up for MetroList emails. Do you happen to know the website, Alexis, with people can sign up for that?
It's www.boston.gov/MetroList. And then there'll be an option on that page to sign up for the weekly newsletter. I'll mention that newsletter goes out Thursday afternoons. And I mention that because we have a lot of events that are posted there, like housing search workshops and virtual appointments to find out more about the housing lottery process. Those are advertised. The only place they're advertised is on MetroList, and they book really quickly.
Excellent. Excellent information. Thank you.
Sure.
And then how does the lottery process work? Like people will log on to the specific housing development that they're looking at if they find one on MetroList, and then is the lottery application available on that website, or does the city oversee it?
It would be nice if I had one clear answer for that, but the one clear answer is that you have to apply to at this point in time, you have to apply to every lottery individually, every property individually. Depending on whether it's an unfunded inclusionary project or one that gets city money, you'll either have quick access, if it's inclusionary, to a link where you can fill out the application online. If it's a city funded project, because of, I won't get too much into this, but because of a lawsuit back in the 80s, we have to use something called a request form. So you just give your name and contact details, and then you'd be connected to a link to the online application and and details about how to access a paper application if you prefer that mode. And that's all handled building by building.
Well, I'm glad to hear that about the paper application, because so many places don't offer that any longer. And for people with disabilities, that could be an accommodation. And the fact that it already exists is really key.
It exists in 11 languages as well.
Really important, because we know disability intersects with so many populations. It's not a separate population. Anybody could have a disability at any time. And like Alexa said, it's not just limited to people in wheelchairs. Sometimes you think that you see the wheelchair symbol that will denote that it's accessible, but it could be any type of disability, not necessarily mobility impairment. So please keep that in mind, when you're thinking about housing. Although we do have units built out for wheelchair access, because certainly that is a specific need. So for the lottery process, once people fill out the application, what are the next steps? Are they automatically given an apartment that they asked for, or how does that work?
That would be lovely. No. if they fill out the application and we have all the information, they answered all the required questions, then they're entered into the lottery. If they miss some stuff, they'll be notified that some information was missing and afforded some time to fix their application. We run the lottery. Every single application that's entered gets assigned a corresponding application number, and then every one of those application numbers gets assigned a lottery number. If they're not offered an opportunity to rent or purchase, well, if they're not, let me stick with rental. If they're not offered the opportunity to rent on initial lease up right after the lottery, that list becomes the waiting list, and the property is obligated to honor that list. The exception being if a unit's built out for people with disabilities, and it's a preference, right? It's not a requirement that it goes to somebody who needs the unit level features. But if somebody was added to the waiting list and needed the built out features, they'll always be prioritized over others who don't need those features.
That's really important. And can you talk a little bit about the features that are in a wheelchair accessible unit?
They range, right? So they have to be a MAAB, the Mass Architectural Access Board standards, right? But wider doorways are the biggest example. Turn radius for people with mobility assistant devices, right? Yes, wheelchairs, but this could also include rollators. It could include walkers, right? People's abilities fluctuate over time, right? And some conditions can diminish over time. Bathrooms have to be accessible, lower countertops, roll under, cook tops and countertops.
Thanks.
Yep, exactly. Sometimes they'll have roll-in showers, but sometimes they're lower threshold tubs as well. And so we have a requirement that properties show the units to people, or depending on where they are in construction, floor plans and finishes, and provide the specific unit level features for people with disabilities to make sure they will work before anybody's required to supply any supporting documents.
Yeah, and that brings up a critical point, which is once you get housing, even if you don't have a wheelchair accessible unit, if you don't get into one of those, you can always request a reasonable accommodation from a landlord. If you're given a unit that has a tub and you need a wheel and shower, you can request that from the landlord. You could also request grab bars in the bathroom and things like that, because people with disabilities are still covered under fair housing for those types of accommodations that they need. Is that right?
Exactly right. And
Okay.
really important. We worry that people don't ask for that enough.
Exactly. Don't think just because you don't have a wheelchair unit or you don't use a wheelchair, you can't ask for accommodations that will help you navigate your apartment more safely and accessibly. So I really want to talk about the waiting. I really don't want to talk about the waiting list, but let's talk about the waiting list. People go on the site for the building they want, they fill out the application, they get a number, and it's a long number or a low number. Does that mean that they'll be waiting for an exceptionally long time?
It depends on the affordability, honestly. If it's deeply affordable, meaning extremely low or very low income households, that list is very long. And that's for units built out for people with disabilities and units that aren't. There's just such a demand.
That's what I was
deeply affordable.
Sorry, that's what I was going to ask. So is the waiting list for people who use wheelchairs any shorter, or does it depend on the project?
It depends on the project and the affordability. For the middle income to low to moderate income households, those lists get exhausted really quickly. Really quickly. And that's why I think it's important to talk about the vouchers and that they're a great fit for these projects. And if you have any type of disability and need affordable housing, go to that CHAMP website and sign up for the alternative housing voucher program.
Yep. And I know that advocates like Felix have done so much work to increase the that voucher program under the state. And the city of Boston is doing a ton of work to encourage development of more housing, because we know it's Boston's biggest challenge, and we really want to keep families and people with disabilities in the city so they can, thrive and have a great life here. So we are doing a lot of work on it. It's just an incredible challenge at this point in time. But on that note, if you have if people have specific questions or just want to learn more, I know that you're doing some workshops on affordable housing. You talked about that a little bit at the beginning. Can you give us more information on that?
Absolutely. So we have these every 2 weeks on Thursday evenings. We go out into the communities, into the different public libraries to hold, in partnership with the Office of Housing Stability. We go out and talk about housing search and how to navigate the housing lottery process with folks. Because of space limitations, we require that folks register. And then we ask, and people have been really good about this, we ask them to confirm that they can attend or let us know if they can't, so we can open up the waiting list and offer that slot. People have been really good about that, which we appreciate. The same goes for virtual appointments that we hold on Tuesday and Thursdays between 11 and 1. To sign up for them, that's where the MetroList newsletter comes in handy. Sign up for MetroList newsletter. That too launches on a Thursday, and you can sign up for these time slots, the in-person library meetings or our virtual appointments.
Thank you for that. And that just goes to show that the city really is doing everything it can to support people in getting stable, affordable, accessible housing. And you make a point about in-person versus virtual. I want to circle back to the lottery. When they're doing the awards for the units, is that actually a lottery, and is that in person or is it virtual?
Thanks for bringing that up. It is well, it's actually neither. We do it remotely, but we record it, right? We do roughly a 20-minute presentation about what the process looks like, what it took to get to the lottery stage, and then what's going to happen that day, what will happen post lottery, including talk about wait lists and how folks would be screened. And then we share that recording and the lottery results with everybody who applied.
Is it something that the public can tune in and watch or access on?
No, because they can they can request the link to the recording if they didn't apply. We're more than happy to share that, but it really just goes out to anybody who was in the lottery.
Okay.
It's really a capacity issue. We're a small shop, and we often we record these lotteries either really early in the morning or later in the evening when we're not otherwise booked.
Okay, so there's no specific time people would log in and watch it. It's really dependent on if you applied, then you'll get notified.
You'll get a link to the recording that will show everything.
Great. And so appreciative of all this work, because we know it's a long process, and everything the city does to move it forward is so helpful.
Thank you.
So just a final thing I want to touch on is we mentioned that April is Affordable Housing Month, and you used to work at the Office of Fair Housing. Can you talk somewhat about discrimination housing? I know Felix talked about it, but are there different things that you can talk to us about, like what discrimination looks like and what people's resources would be to, respond to discrimination?
Sure. Anytime somebody feels like their access to housing has been impacted by a protected status, and Felix, you mentioned all of these, but it can be race, national origin, familial status. One that's unique to Massachusetts is source of income, so that voucher status, religion. Anytime you feel discriminated against, that you feel like you can't get the housing or the support you need while housed.
And I'm not sure, did you mention disability?
I thought I did, but yes, disability for sure. Yeah, important. That anytime you feel like your access to housing, and housing in the same way that anybody experiences it, is compromised, then you can and should file a discrimination complaint. You can do that through the Massachusetts Commission Against Discrimination, or MCAD. You can also do it if it's happened within the city of Boston. You can also do that through the Boston Fair Housing Commission. And they have some teeth, not a lot, but they do have some, where it's not a fast acting solution, but they can hold the property accountable. And there's typically a significant financial penalty, where they can address and fixing what they did wrong, right? Giving you back the access that you need is often one of the outcomes as well.
And, you know, for people who don't realize what discrimination is, maybe we can offer a few examples. One thing I'm thinking of is if you request a reasonable accommodation, like say you need grab bars in your bathroom, you request it from a landlord and they ignore the request, or they just say, no, they can't afford it. Is that something that would be a case of discrimination?
It could be, yes.
Okay.
I say it could be, which isn't the best answer. I say it could be because if there are certain thresholds, right? Where if they have adapted, say they had 10 units and they had already adapted 9, they could make an argument that it was in fact cost prohibitive.
I see. Okay. But it shouldn't discourage people from requesting.
Absolutely not. It's rare that it would be, it's rare that you would see something specific like that. But other examples, ones that strike me, are people who have to, you know, when you're applying, especially for affordable housing, there's a mitigating circumstance clause, right? Like, so say you were struggling to pay your rent previously, or in a market rate unit, and you had lost your income because of a disability related reason that caused a challenge in paying your rent. That you got a voucher as an example, and now payment of rent isn't a concern, but they're trying to keep you out. Some people will feel compelled to overshare medical detail about their disability to get a mitigating circumstance, to get an accommodation, and to have whatever that screening requirement was removed and get the unit to get housed, right? And if we've heard from constituents who feel like that information was then used against them, and that's a discrimination as well. And right, they have a right to privacy and dignity, and their information can't be shared like that. And it can be classified as retaliation, which is also protected under.
Okay. So I think what I'm learning from this whole conversation with you is housing is very complex and complicated.
Yeah.
Attaining housing, attaining funding for housing, figuring out housing discrimination, they can all be very complex processes. So to wrap up, I think we should leave people with some resources. I know the city has several offices. They have the Office of Housing Stability, and that works to actually what's their mission? Do you know? They find people housing, or
Their main priority is helping people at risk of losing their housing, but they're also part of MetroList, where they do the housing search. So there is that component.
okay.
Mhm.
So we have MetroList, we have the Boston Office of Fair Housing, and we have Mass Commission Against Discrimination. Those are the 3 main ones that we would recommend people reach out to for more information. And then also Alex's information sessions, and those are also listed on MetroList.
Exactly.
So
I would say too, like the Boston Center for Independent Living, because they also know they can connect with us.
great. So the easiest way, though, it would be the MetroList. Sign up for that because that has everything that you need to know. And we hope this session was helpful for everybody. We encourage you not to get discouraged. We know it's a long process, but the city's working on it and advocates are working on it. So please, you know, let us know if you need any more information. And I really want to thank Alexis for all her valuable information and her time today.